Alright, for this video I wanted to go over a sample form 8832 entity classification election, but specifically what we're going to cover here is late election relief procedures, right, under Revenue Procedure 2009-41. So in this sample we have a single member LLC that's a disregarded entity, and it wants to file this 8832 to make a C Corp election. So I've got the 8832 in front of us here, and it does include a reasonable cause statement at the end of it, which we'll go through as well. And then in addition to the form itself, we do have one slide here outlining some of the general rules on these elections and then the fact pattern that we're going to be working with in this example. So what are kind of the general filing requirements to make this election? So again, in our case, we're going to have a single member LLC, disregarded entity, wants to make a C Corp election. So in order to start the filing process, the entity that's filing this election has to be either a domestic, so that's a U.S. entity, or a foreign entity, and it has to be an eligible entity. Right, so in our case here we have an LLC that is a U.S. LLC, so it's a domestic entity, and LLCs are eligible entities for purposes of these elections. Now the 8832 should be signed by all the owners of the company, and it has to be filed within 75 days of that desired effective date. So if I set up a company today, I've got 75 days to get the election prepared, signed, and filed, and then it's timely. In our case here, we missed the 75-day window, right? So that's why we're doing the late election relief procedures. So what are the procedures under this Revenue Procedure 2009-41? In order to qualify for relief, the entity has to meet these four elements. So the first one is our failure to qualify as a C Corp, right? That's our desired election, was solely because the election was not timely filed. So what does that mean? So in other words, what we're saying here is that there's no other defect that would need to be cured to make this C Corp election. Really the only thing that is wrong here is we just simply missed the filing to elect C Corp status. So for example, if we had an entity that was not an eligible entity, right? So let's say we were filing this and we wanted to file it for a trust and make the trust a C Corp election. Well, that's a problem, right? So the first point there, we're not going to be able to qualify as a C Corp even if we timely filed the election because the trust is not an eligible entity, right? You can't make elections for those types of arrangements. So in our case here, the entity fails to qualify simply because we just missed the filing. Okay, that's fine. That's the first element. The second piece here is the entity has not yet filed a federal tax return for the first year the election was intended because the due date has not passed. So in other words, we're catching the issue before we even reach that first deadline for the first tax return. Or the entity has timely filed tax returns consistent with the election. So in other words, what does that mean? That means that, okay, maybe we're beyond the first due date of the return, but we did file it anyway. So we filed a tax return for a C Corp, we filed the 1120, but we forgot to do the 8832. If you've been filing tax returns consistent with the election, that's okay. You can still file this election late. The 8832 can be filed late. The third element there, the entity has a reasonable cause for its failure to timely file, so that's really important, right? You've got to lay out a good reason, a good excuse for why it is you missed the filing. And then lastly, the entity is filing this election within 3 years and 75 days from the requested effective date. So there is a cap on it, right? So you have to catch this error within 3 years and 75 days. And so, let's say this is year 2 or 3. If we're under that mark, we can still file this election if we missed it. And we also have to have been filing tax returns consistent with the election, right? So points 2 and 4 kind of go hand in hand, right? If you miss the first, if you catch the error before the first tax return is due, that's great. If you forget to file the election, but you've been filing tax returns consistent with the election as if it was made, then you have 3 years and 75 days before you have to cure the error. So let's have a look at our fact pattern here, and then we'll jump into the 8832. So the fact pattern we've got here, we have a U.S. person, so John Q. taxpayer. He opens a Delaware LLC September 1st, 2022, and he wants to run a consulting business through this entity. Now, John discovers that the default treatment for a single member LLC is a disregarded entity, and he doesn't like that, right? He wants to have it a separate regarded entity, file its own tax return. So he wants to file an election to change the tax classification to a C Corp. Now, John mistakenly thought that the election would just be filed with the first tax return. So the initial Form 1120, that's going to be filed for 2022, I'll just do it then. So a few months go by, and on February 15, 2023, John contacts a tax preparer to assist with the filings. And it's at that point that the tax preparer tells him, well, the 8832, it should have been filed already. So it should have been filed on or before November 15th, 2022. So that's 75 days after September 1st. That's when he should have been filing this form, but he's missed it, right? So he's missed it by a couple of months. So John prepares the 8832, and he's going to file under the late election relief procedures. All right, so let's have a look at the election form itself, and we'll go through the form and the reasonable cause statement. So information on the entity goes at the top here, right? So the name of the company, address, and the EIN, so the tax ID number for the LLC. And then again, we are checking the late election relief box here, right? So we're pursuing late election relief under Rev Proc 2009-41. The 2010-32 would be if we've already made an election and now we want to change it. So that doesn't apply to us because this is an initial classification. So part one, the type of election here, again, this is an initial classification by a newly formed entity. So we're not having a change in its current classification. Now, skip down to item 3, and it asks us, does this eligible entity have more than one owner? And the answer is no, right? It's just owned by one person, John taxpayer. So it tells us here, okay, if we have one owner only, the only elections available to us are to make an election to be association taxable as a corporation, right? That's what we're going to do, or to be a disregarded entity. Well, we're already a disregarded entity, so we're making the corporation election. So item 4, if we do have one owner, whether it's a person or it could be a trust or another entity, you have to provide the information on that owner. So we have John Q. taxpayer, and then John is a U.S. person, so he would enter his Social Security number. If this was for a foreign, so a non-U.S. person that didn't have a U.S. tax ID number, that's fine, right? You can just put foreign, U.S., or non-resident, and that'll let the IRS know that this is the owner is a non-U.S. person or non-U.S. entity. Okay. Now, part 1, page 2 here, the type of entity, right? So we've got a number of options here, split between domestic and foreign, and our selection here is going to be 6A, right? So we have a domestic eligible entity, that's a U.S. LLC, electing to be classified as an association taxable as a corp. Okay. Now, item 7 we can leave blank because this is a U.S. entity, but if we had a foreign entity, we should enter the foreign country where the company was formed. So in our case, this is the United States, so we can just leave it blank. Then this is really important, right? When do we want the election to be effective? And this is the whole issue that John has here, is he wants the election to be effective the very same day he set up the entity. So September 1st, 2022. And again, we're filing this late because we are filing beyond 75 days from that desired effective date. So items 9 and 10, contact information for somebody responsible for the filing. This is generally the owner, right? So who's going to be the owner of the company, but not necessarily, right? So if you have an entity with a lot of owners, you can appoint just one person that might be the manager or an officer or director of the company. And then lastly here, this has to be signed by all the owners of the entity. So that's the general standard, right? So you want to have this signed by everybody that's an owner of the company. But if you have, let's say, a multi-member LLC, you can have just one managing member. So if you have a manager or managing member, or a CEO or somebody that is authorized to bind everybody to the agreement, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be all the owners, but that is kind of the general rule. But if you have one person that is authorized to make this election on everybody's behalf, then that person can be the only one that signs. That's okay. And then part 2. This is the late election relief section. So if we're filing this timely, then this part 2 would just be blank. But in our case, it's not timely, right? So we're filing under the late election relief procedures. Now, in item 11 here, you could type in your reasonable cause statement and everything here, but you notice it's only a handful of lines. And so I found that I can never fit everything in here. So that's why I use see attached statement, and then I attach a statement behind it. So same issues with the signature, right? Everybody should sign, or the one authorized person. And then the last piece here is this late election relief procedure statement. So in this statement, we're outlining what happened and why we're eligible for relief under the Rev Proc. So I'll just go through the narrative here. You can read along with me. So we've got Fake Company LLC, the taxpayer, formed and organized as a single-member LLC in the state of Delaware on September 1st, right? The taxpayer intended to file this election to be classified as an association taxable as a corp, right, effective the same day, September 1st, 2022, or the effective date. Taxpayers requesting relief under Rev Proc 2009-41 for a late-filed 8832 entity classification election. And then in paragraph 2, we outline the elements of the Rev Proc, right? Why are we eligible for relief, right? So the taxpayer failed to obtain its classification solely because the 8832 is not filed timely. Taxpayer has not yet filed Form 1120 tax return for the initial year because the due date has not passed. Taxpayer's reasonable cause for failure to timely file. And 3 years and 75 days from this requested effective date have not yet passed, right? So we meet all 4 elements of that Rev Proc. Paragraph 3 there, taxpayer's reasonable cause for its failure to timely make this entity classification election, right? So we were formed as a single-member LLC on September 1. We wanted to be a U.S. corporation for federal tax purposes beginning on that effective date. And we believed that the election could be filed concurrently with the initial 1120. Very common error, right? I see this all the time, and this is a good, reasonable excuse for why it wasn't timely filed, and the IRS generally accepts this. So on February 15th, 2023, taxpayer hired a U.S. professional to assist with preparing the form for the 2022 tax period, and it's at that point that the tax professional advised that the entity classification election should have been separately filed using the 8832, right? So we can't file it. You can file it with the 1120, but it's late, right? So should have been filed earlier. So upon learning this area, taxpayer immediately prepared and filed the 8832 entity classification election. Now, the statement must also include this perjury declaration, right? So under penalties of perjury. And so just for reference, the same kind of statement exists, up here, right? So under penalties of perjury, we declare that we've examined the selection, including all the accompanying documents, and to the best of my knowledge and belief, the election contains all the relevant facts relating to the election, and such facts are true, correct, and complete. I further declare that I have personal knowledge of these facts and circumstances. I further declare that the elements required for relief in Section 4.01 of Rev Proc 2009-41 have been satisfied. And then again, lastly, we want to have either all the members sign it or an authorized representative can sign it. In our case here, John Taxpayer, he just goes ahead and signs again. So sign, date, and then include this behind the 8832, and then you're ready to go. So always check the form instructions for where to file this, right? So they tend to update the addresses kind of without telling us often. So the 8832 instructions have mailing addresses for where you should send this depending on where the entity is set up. So that's generally how they do it. If it's a foreign entity, it goes to one address. If it's a U.S. company, it goes to a separate address. So check those addresses before you file, just to make sure you are sending it to the correct IRS office. All right, so that covers it for this tutorial. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment below, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next video. Thank you.